Hello and welcome to today's webinar about how landlords can work with a national platform for tenants to drive safety. Today's event, sponsored by ACO, is about an area that should be of fundamental importance to the housing sector. As a reminder, after the Grenfell Tower fire, then Prime Minister Theresa May talked about the importance of giving residents more of a voice and bringing them into the political process. Various other groups, including Shelter, reached the conclusion that there should be some kind of national tenants' voice or union set up. The London Tenants Federation's current manifesto calls for a thriving national federation of tenants funded by central government. A small steering group was set up after the fire to look at setting up a national tenants' voice. 2 years ago, Inside Housing I held a roundtable with this group to see how that might work. But while the recent white paper underlines the importance of improving engagement between tenants and landlords, it doesn't include a proposal for any such national platform. As part of our ongoing safety campaign sponsored by ACO, we're asking today how such a platform might be established and organised. We'll also be getting some insight from one of the people who was involved in that National Tenant Voice Steering Group. So a bit of background about how we've got here and where we might go next. And an absolutely crucial debate for us to be having and thinking about how we progress. So, yeah, we've got a great panel lined up to talk us through that today, and we'll be hearing from Darren Hartley, Chief Executive of Tenant and Resident Charity Taro, part of that Voice for Tenants Steering Group, Sasha Deepwell, Chief Executive of Irwell Valley Homes and Chair of the GM Community-Led Homes Steering Group, charged with shaping the strategy for community-led housing across Greater Manchester. We'll also be hearing from Tina Mystery, Relationship Manager with ACO, and Alan Strickland, Director of External Affairs and Resident Involvement with Optivo. So welcome all, and yeah, an absolutely cracking panel lined up for us today to discuss these issues. But just a reminder, thank you all for tuning in, and I know we've attempted this webinar previously, so for anybody who's was a previous attendee, thanks for bearing with us through those technical difficulties, and yeah, we're up and running this morning and looking forward to a great discussion and debate. And obviously this is about guiding your thinking and being useful for you in your organisations and in your work moving forwards too. So please, as the presentations take place and afterwards, use the Q&A box attached to ask your questions, the things that are going to be most useful to you and help guide your thinking and get the answers to the questions that you want. So just a reminder, please use that Q&A box throughout. And I'll pick up on as many questions as possible following the opening presentations. Right, all of which brings us very nicely to the start of today's presentations. And Darren, welcome. It's good to get off the ground. So yeah, for the third attempt. So yeah, welcome, and the floor is yours, Darren. It's over to you.
Thank you, Martin. Firstly, a big thank you to Inside Housing and also to ACO for inviting me to speak today. I guess I see the function of this initial presentation as an opportunity to really set the context for the debate that's to follow in today's session. Little bit just about in what capacity I'm talking today. I'm representing Taro Trust. For those that aren't already familiar with us, we're a national charity that was established in 2013, but our origins go back into the 1970s, and the strong level of kind of tenant activism that dates back to that time also. I should, big disclaimer right at the up front is that we're not claiming to represent all tenants, but just to highlight that we do work on behalf of tenants and regularly engage directly with tenants in our work, both on an individual and a collective level. This next slide really just gives a little bit more information about the kinds of things that we do, and I'd invite viewers to our website or to contact us directly if they want to know more about that. I've also just kind of highlighted what our key objectives are, and one of the things which we've been calling for a number of times, I guess, which is essentially summarised in our existing manifesto for change, which is currently up for review and will be going out to consultation on that in the next few weeks. One of the key things which we've been calling for is for a national voice for tenants to be established, really just to promote and ensure that those voices of tenants and residents living within the sector are heard at the highest levels of national policy and decision making. So a little bit about the kind of the background and some of the changes which are happening now, which has meant that tenants' voices are being brought more to the fore, that there is a changing of the pendulum, and we do see that in the wake of Grenfell terrible events and the range of things which have been happening in the last few years, albeit somewhat slowly, that there is movement towards greater voices for tenants being heard. What's new, of course, building safety, which is the key kind of focus of today's. It does involve a new building safety regulator, and only yesterday we saw the release in Parliament of the new building safety bill. There's requirements within that, for instance, resident engagement strategies and for the provision of specific information to be provided for residents. Not just on the building safety specific front, though, we've seen the residents panel be established by the Housing Ombudsman Service. We've seen within the recent white paper, or relatively recent white paper, the stated aims of movement towards greater proactive consumer regulation, and that invariably will also lead to a review of regulatory standards, including tenant involvement and engagement standard. And we've seen the ongoing ministerial engagement and events which took place particularly around the Green Paper around 2018 and 19. This slide just gives some additional details around the specifics of residents being directly involved with the building safety regulator when that is established and operational. And essentially what it means is that there is going to be avenues through which residents can have an input into the new regime. Of course, what does that mean? It means that national policy will have some degree of influence, and it remains to be seen because of the requirement for further regulations to be passed to give the detail as to how far-reaching that will be. I guess the message there, though, is that it's not, that doesn't involve working directly with landlords, so that it remains incumbent upon landlords to have effective engagement with their own tenants and residents on this particular subject. And regardless of whether that's enshrined in the legislation and the regulations, that really is a key message that landlords should be working effectively on those relationships. There's been good practice, not least the Social Sector Building Safety Engagement Best Practice Group, which has released a range of materials around building safety and effective engagement. And I guess what some of the issues really that this goes to the nub of is that when those landlords are engaging, have a think about the approach, what you're seeking to achieve, and the benefits of softer approaches versus harder policing, because you're likely to get greater levels of buy-in from residents through those softer approaches. Gaps in the current framework, of course, what we haven't seen, which featured in the earlier Green Paper, is within the White Paper, call for a national platform, and there were questions specifically on this within the earlier Green Paper. What does that mean? Well, if we don't move forward with a national platform, it means that the types of engagement that are taking place are largely function-based. They are accountability is to the particular bodies as opposed to at a national level, and also that the themes and the issues are quite selective. And I'd say there's an imbalance of power there, because often the issues which are being established for discussion are being set by the bodies more than what they might be established by the residents themselves. There's also the question about the filtering then, about the people who get involved, and the age-old question of representation and representativeness of those groups. Of course, there was research that took place by the Voices for Tenant Steering Group, which overwhelmingly indicated that there was support from residents across the country for a national platform to be established. And we'd like to see further research to take place to what that might actually look like. I think it's a weak response just to say that this is a difficult thing to do. and therefore we shouldn't sort of raise to the challenge of doing it. Yes, there are lessons to be learned from the history of the national tenant voice, sort of 10 or so years ago, which was extremely short-lived. And yes, there are also issues there around representativeness. But essentially, you could levy that sort of criticism at there are various groups that represent landlord groups, and they don't always agree. But just because they doesn't agree doesn't mean that there isn't benefits from that collective voices being heard, which at present there just isn't for residents. So we think that there needs to be some levelling up of the playing field there. And what I've highlighted here, and hopefully we can get into as we talk through, are some of the kind of features that might reflect a platform if that were to be established. Essentially, I think this should give the opportunity for residents to be able to set the agenda, to raise the issues, so that it's their views that are heard more strongly and forcibly and loudly by those people who are in power and involved in decision making. But of course, as I said, I think there is research that needs to take place to establish what that might look like. Okay, I'm going to hand over to the next speaker because I think my allotted 8 minutes is up. So thank you, Martin.
Thank you very much, Darren. Yeah, great opening, and some real challenging questions to pick up on. Speaking of which, we've got some questions coming through to the Q&A box already. Thank you very much for that. Do keep them coming in, and I will pick up on as many as possible following the presentation. So yeah, thank you very much. Right, thank you, Darren and Sasha. Welcome. The floor is yours. It's over to you.
Thanks, Martin and Darren, and hello, everybody. So I'm going to sort of give a perspective from as a landlord, but also as Martin indicated, some of the other roles that I fulfil as well. My role in supporting community-led housing across Greater Manchester, and also my personal experience of doing that in Merseyside as well. So just a bit about Irwell Valley, just to give you the landlord perspective. Traditional housing association with a range of tenures, mainly social rent, and a number of specialist schemes for groups ranging from those with dementia through to young people leaving care. We're members of Greater Manchester Housing Providers, Place Shapers and the National Housing Federation. So just picking up on Darren's view there are a number of different landlord bodies that do have very different perspectives actually on this issue. So that's quite interesting. And we're an incubator for the Greater Manchester Community-Led Housing Hub, which is a really interesting new development in Greater Manchester where so far 40 community-led housing groups have come together and are looking to develop new tenures of housing, including co-housing, housing co-ops, and other forms, community land trusts and other forms of community-led housing, some geographical, neighbourhood-led and others around communities of interest. So those different perspectives, I think, are useful in looking at how we work together on this issue of building safety. So there's the perspective of those of us who are landlords. Then there's the idea of, do we have collective regional voices, which I'd like to bring into the mix before then moving to considering the national voice perspective. So in terms of a landlord, there is so much that I'm sure many of you who are landlords out there are already doing and should be doing as a good landlord. So, for just an example from what we've been doing, we have a very extensive customer voice network with about 1,300 customers actively engaged with us. And when we do something specific, like, for example, last year, we refreshed our customer offer and we got customers engaged in that, because I very much agree with Darren's view that, the customer voice and setting priorities against what customers want is really, really important. So over 3,000 customers inputted into the new customer offer in terms of saying what their priorities were for services. We're regularly communicating with them about performance and getting really high engagement rates on that. So that's really good to see. And in more detailed policies, such as things like repairs as well, we're getting lots of views. We do and always have had a resident scrutiny panel, and it's got a direct link into the board, which I think is really important from a governance perspective, so that they report directly on outcomes of their reviews, their scrutinies, and their recommendations are fed to audit committee, who then make sure that they're carried out just like any other audit recommendations would be. Now, very specifically on building safety, we have lots and lots of issues, as do all landlords around this. We have high rises, and we also have lower rise buildings below 18 metres, many with leaseholders in them. And some of you will be aware that, we've been very much in the media recently about some of that, where we are working very closely with residents, and it's not always amicably, but the point is we are engaging and, getting the views of leaseholders and working together with them to address some of these really, really difficult issues about what works.
I think we have lost Sasha. Apologies there. So I will just step in and cover for a few seconds, see whether we can get Sasha back online. And if not, I will move to the next. Sasha, that sounds like you're back.
Did everyone lose me then?
Yes, we did. You are back. By the looks of it, so I will hand back to you. We only lost you for about probably about 30 seconds there, but I will hand back over to you, Sasha, and welcome back. Good to see you.
I'm so sorry about this. It's probably my very dodgy internet connection kicking in here. I don't know if I started talking about some of the fire safety issues when you lost me, but sorry, I've lost you now.
Talking about the fire safety issues, so over to you.
Okay. So we are working with leaseholders and with tenants. We have a number of high-rise blocks, but we also have lower-rise, predominantly leaseholder blocks. And we're working with residents across all tenures around building safety issues. It's not always an easy relationship, particularly with leaseholders, because some of the issues around, who pays for works, and also there's a lot of issues and concerns about responsibility for building safety and how, it's determined whether some of the issues that we're uncovering, were issues that were there when the buildings were built, when they met current regulations at the time, and how we meet the new regulations. And it's a very complex issue. But what we've learned is it is really important, as Darren mentioned before, to try and work together with leaseholders and tenants on these issues. We've had some very positive input, particularly with social housing tenants, in terms of the building safety work that we're doing. And we have our own high-rise working group with customers on that, which is looking at how we present information in the best way to customers, as well as many other issues. Going forward, we intend to build on that work. Really, one of the very specific issues that I just want to highlight within that is the issue of involving a diverse range of customers who don't always get their voice heard. And we have a panel of customers who've come forward to work with us on that and promote customer voice across diversity strands. So a lot of what we're trying to do is be as open and as up to date as we can be with information on building safety. And that's a difficult thing, because we are constantly being updated ourselves and then digesting that information and then presenting it to customers. But we strongly believe that this is the way that you have to do it. There's no point sort of trying to hold information to yourselves. It's really important to share things, even though it does sometimes lead to very difficult discussions and debates. And then in terms of the regional perspective on this, we are working together as GMHP. There's a bit of information here about who we are and the influence that we hold in Greater Manchester, because of the scale of the landlords coming together here. And that's quite important in terms of tenant voice, because at the moment what we're doing is we've had a survey out which has had a really great response across all the landlords in Greater Manchester housing providers, and we're working together to set up a joint tenant voice so that we can actually have a regional tenant voice to work with us on all the key issues that specifically tenants in Greater Manchester would like us to address. And we have a specific work stream on building safety as part of the work we're doing together that we would be then consulting and working with tenants across landlords on. So that's going to be quite an interesting development. It's early days. We've only just had the survey back, but it's looking very positive in terms of tenants being up for doing this work together. And one of the things we have done across Greater Manchester is worked with communities of interest. There's an example here from House Proud Northwest, where we've set up, or customers have set up, an organisation called Rainbow Roofs, which is a customer-based organisation which is working with landlords to improve the services that we provide for LGBTQ plus customers. And that's just one example of what we're doing in a sort of regional level. The other thing I should have said about the regional voice is where I started in terms of the community-led housing movement and the way that we're working there, which is a completely community and customer-driven approach. And through that work, we are working with some existing as well as some new groups, and certainly working very proactively on their agendas, which actually at the moment in time are more focused towards dealing with the housing crisis and providing new homes as a priority. But they are also looking at repairs and picking up on some of the issues that have been coming through, particularly the ITN reports, in terms of ensuring that properties are well repaired and that landlords listen to customers. So it's very much around the voice issue, which we hope, working collectively with the tenant voice across GM, will also assist with getting that better dialogue and communication across landlords. So I'm just going to finish on some thoughts and questions on the national idea. And first of all, just to say, I think it's a really, really positive idea. Personally, I'm a board member of Northwest Housing Services, which again is a community-led, customer-led organisation. And I just think that having that sort of powerful voice coming from residents could really help us not only understand their priorities, but also assist lobbying for better policies and better resources, which are clearly going to be needed if we are going to achieve what's needed to be achieved in terms of not only building safety, but also looking to the future, the green agenda. And I'm wondering whether these things could coalesce and whether sort of building this strong resident voice and strategies around the home and the property, the condition of the property, the safety of the property, and also taking it into the green agenda could be really helpful. Darren's already raised questions of overlaps. We've got customers on the Ombudsman panel. And so, yeah, I just think there could be some overlaps there. I don't think that's particularly a problem. I just did want to also raise the question of, is this a voice, a platform, or is this an organisation? And I think that's a question that will need to be answered. So is it multiple organisations contributing to a national voice, or is it an organisation to represent customers nationally? And who leads that and who decides that? Just questions that haven't been answered yet. So that would probably be over to the audience here for debate. And on that note, I'm going to finish because I know my time's up. I hope you heard the last bit of that. So thank you very much for listening.
Thanks, Sasha. Loud and clear, and yeah, some great questions to pick up on. And I think interesting to see how some of those existing or structures that are starting to form perhaps might work together as well. As certainly got some questions around that. Loads of questions coming in. Thank you all very much for doing that. So I will move swiftly on, but I will just remind you that the Q&A box is there if you want to get the takeaways that are going to be useful for you in your own to guide your own thinking or your own work. Then please do use that Q&A box, and I will try and get through as many as possible when the presentations are done. Thank you very much, Sasha and Tina. Welcome, and it is over to you.
Thank you very much, Martin. Hope you can all hear and see me okay. Before I'm about to start, I think on perspective of a national platform, it needs to be a platform that represents all types of tenure. So when we refer to all types of tenure, we're referring to social, private, and private landlords, social rental, private landlords, and homeowners. I say that with the perspective of a wider agenda of what we're trying to achieve, because exactly as the previous speakers have spoken about, it's not just about building safety. It's also about the future agendas of social housing in terms of the net zero conversation. We all talk a lot about how we work, but there are other models in other sectors that could be looked at potentially. I think within social housing, we tend to concentrate on models that we're familiar with. But is it time for us to also look at other models out of the sector, such as audience development? And I bring this up from a background of arts and culture. So over here, you've got a segmentation of a box. It talks about existing programs and existing audiences. So when we talk about joint scrutiny panels, we talk about co-creation, but are those the normal residents we normally engage with on that top left-hand box? Then we've got existing programs and new audiences. So we're bringing in the agenda of net zero and decarbonisation. It's a new agenda, but maybe with the new audience as well. Then we've got new programs, new audiences, new programs and existing audiences. So existing is who we work with on co-creation or scrutiny panels, a new program and an audience. We all know about specific audiences that are difficult to target. We talk about diverse communities, the younger generation, and they've been around for many years as key points of discussion. How do we tackle that? Do we take our residents and segment them into 4 different areas? And now this is not just within an RSL context, but also the context of working with all different tenure as well. We talk about empowerment, we talk about engaging. As a sector, we're brilliant at informing. We consult, we involve, but do we truly collaborate? What does collaboration really mean, and how do we really empower? This is a model that was taken from Sustaining Communities, a brilliant model to look at, because we get to that stage, we inform, we'll say, we want to go out and do consultation on building safety and engagement. We want you to have your voice as residents. We'll go out and consult and create mini focus groups and forums. Then we involve. We take some aspects on board, but then how do we really put that ownership back onto the residents? You hear a lot about we've got a panel. We were involved with the resident safety campaign for 2 years and 3 years of sitting on those panels and actually deciding the winners. What you do see is a lot of the same residents participating in the same forums. But it's a slight switch. Should we not be asking residents to peer support each other? So not all residents want to be engaged, but there are ways of residents actually engaging with residents. It's not just about RSLs engaging with residents, is it? So is that something we need to consider and take into consideration, and then talk about empowerment? This model is an interesting one. It's about the 5 dysfunctions of a team. It's from a model from Patrick Lencioni. Now, this can be applied in the context of internal in an organisation, but externally too. When we talk about the consumer engagement white paper, let's talk about what's happened at Grenfell. The main bottom pillar there is based around trust. How are we meant to have conflict, commitment, and accountability and results if we can't get the trust right? We talk about the draft bill that says that residents should have be able to have an open, transparent conversation with you as an RSL. But if you can't have that conflict, and it's not, you can't ask residents to be held accountable to each other if we don't have trust. If we take that internally within an RSL, as many times as we know, there's some really great work happening there, dysfunctionality and silo working. So we've got a disconnect between different teams. So let's take the building safety agenda, for example. We say we need to build homes, build new homes that are going to be kept, built up to the in requirements to the 8 stages of REBA, overlapping the 3 gateways. But then you've got the asset development team sitting one side, and then you've got maintenance team on the other. Where is the trust and communication happening internally to have a cohesive approach and then take the same model internally, externally to residents? This also could be applied to culture change. We talk about culture change within an organisation, but that has to be trust from top to bottom and bottom to up. But the first main pillar we have to get right as a sector is that trust. And then only when do we have the trust can we have healthy conflict and disagreement. And then we've got joint commitment leading into accountability of each other internally and accountability externally. And at the top of the pyramid, will we get those results. Change is something that not many people like. We're all used to working a certain way, and COVID has shown one thing, is that we talked about communities being digitally excluded, lack of engagement. There was a different type of engagement with change. This is the change curve, and this change curve is an interesting one. Every time we make change, whether it's agenda within social housing, whether it's regarding the way we conduct ourselves within the sector or out of the sector, there are a few initial conversations. So when we talk about a national platform, it's a national platform needed, for example. Originally, there may be shock. I can't believe it's needed. Then we go into denial. There'll be the anger. There'll be the bargaining in terms of can this work and can this not work. Then there'll be the depression stage, as in we're performing really bad. And then we'll go into acceptance and then problem solving and coming back together. But apply this change curve to everything we do. Regarding resident engagement, regarding a national platform, regarding building safety, or the net zero conversation. And I think if we were to apply different models of thinking and thought process, can we achieve something a lot better? And is there more that we could do collaboratively together, and then want to make the resident voice the most strongest it's ever been and so much needed than before? So a national platform, I'm going to stop my slides there. And just to say, a national platform on a thought process is definitely needed, but it's about collaborative working. It's not just about one organisation like Taro, it's about everyone collectively to coming together to have the same goal and objective, and a platform should be there for all tenure, private, social, and homeowners equally as well. And that's me, Martin. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tina. And so I mean, a great question to kind of end on there as well. Huge amounts of food for thought, but also that kind of cross tenure platform, and certainly something I think we'll pick up on later. I'm going to move on very quickly because we've got loads of questions coming in. And I want to make sure we get through as many as we possibly can. Helen, you've asked a question. A member of the North East tenants' voice, would certainly be good to know the extent to which, you're talking about residents taking over the reins, the extent to which that is the case when it comes to the North East tenant voice. So just to throw out to one of the people who's asked the question already, and do keep those questions coming in. Right, thank you very much, Tina. And Alan, welcome, and please take away your presentation. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Martin, and good afternoon, everyone. It's somebody from the North East. I would certainly welcome more questions from the North East. So I'm going to do this the old-fashioned way. I haven't got any slides, but there are really three things that I want to say in response to this really important question around, how can a national platform for tenants work with landlords to drive safety? So I think the first thing to say is, how do we do this? How do we make it work? Well, any national platform, I think, has to deliver the outcomes on tenant involvement that we've already agreed. And I think they've been broadly agreed in two ways. The first is that, since Grenfell, there's been huge amounts of work in the sector, led by the National Housing Federation, through the Together with Tenants initiative, around, what do tenants want? What do tenants feel is missing? What do tenants feel are the sort of key parts of the relationship between landlord and tenant? And if you look at the charter, it talks about improving relationships, getting communication to really work, giving tenants real voice and influence, having proper accountability, getting quality right, but also making sure that people can complain effectively and get a proper response. So, all of the themes in the charter, I think, really chime with what we're seeing coming out of the Grenfell inquiry, what we're learning has gone wrong there and in other places. And the social housing white paper, of course, I think is the other key part of this. And the themes in the white paper sort of broadly mirror what's in the Together with Tenants Charter. And of course, the first priority in the white paper is that tenants, residents, should feel safe in their home. So I think that should be our starting point. Our starting point should be, how can a national platform for tenants deliver the outcomes that tenants have already told us as a sector and have already told government, through all of those consultation workshops that ministers ran, that they want to do. That, I think, has to be the starting point. So the second question, I think, then, for me is, well, how could a national tenant voice support these ambitions? There's been lots of consultation in the sector. How could a national tenant platform really help to deliver this? Now, obviously, that's ultimately for tenants themselves to decide, and I think we have to be humble as landlords. This is not for us to sort of dictate how it would work. But I think, my response would be that there are some key areas where a national platform could help. The first, as colleagues have said, is really around accountability. So there are major challenges facing tenants and wider residents on fire safety bills, on how we make blocks safe, how we might do more intrusive works. All of this is really difficult. And where's the tenant voice nationally on that? Where is the forum in which, residents and tenants can hold ministers accountable for some of the things that we know government isn't probably getting quite right? Second thing, I think, is around sharing good practice. And I think there would be real value in, tenants themselves sharing examples of where they feel landlords, are getting it right, where landlords are grappling with that really difficult package of issues around tenant involvement and fire safety and are doing good stuff. Third thing, I think, is around raising the profile of common tenant issues. As others have said, I think it's difficult to make this body sort of representative. I don't think what we want is a sort of tenant parliament. I don't think that's possible to do. It wouldn't work. But actually pulling out what are the common things that tenants are worried about across the country and giving voice to that, I think could be quite helpful. And the fourth and final thing in terms of how it might work, I think, is acting as a sounding board. Is a diverse group of people that ministers and officials could go to as part of wider engagement. It mustn't be the only way that they can get a sort of national tenant view on. But I think in doing these things, performing these functions, any national tenant platform, I think, would have to be delivered in a way that respects some key principles. The first for me really is that the tenant-landlord relationship, is the bedrock of successful tenant engagement. So what the national body would need to do, is to support and enhance relationships locally between tenants and landlords help both to do that better. Because what we don't want is that landlords think, fine, national tenant voice, it's all sorted, I don't need to talk to my tenants. We equally don't want to create any sort of division in that relationship. Second thing is to recognise that social housing tenants are an incredibly diverse group, and everybody on this call who works with residents will know that you get very different tenant experiences even within the same block when you knock on doors to talk about fire safety, let alone across the tenant body nationally. So I think that needs to be recognised, and we should be wary, I think, of any tenant platform should be wary of saying what tenants think is. There isn't one view of tenants, and that needs to be recognised. Third principle, I think, is that any new body should have real clarity of role and purpose, because I think as a sector we're very good at reinventing wheels, and we've already got the regulator, we've got the ombudsman, we've got TPAS, we've got Taro. Any platform would need to have a distinctive place in what already is quite a busy, crowded landscape, and that will need some thought. Excuse me. Fourth principle is, of course, it must be tenant-led. I know that sounds like an obvious thing to say, but making it properly tenant-led means that the agenda will be set by tenants, the arrangements will be set by tenants. I'm sure those residents will want to talk to landlords to make sure it has the confidence of landlords, but actually doing this properly, means as a landlord, we'd have to give freedom, we'd have to give license, we'd have to be quite relaxed about a body saying things we didn't like some of the time. And final principle, I think, is it needs to be constructive. So it mustn't just be a talking shop. It should be focused on making a positive impact. So the third and final thing I want to say, really, is that, while these discussions are going on, I think landlords can make real progress on these issues. We can embed the principles of the Together with Tenants Charter and the White Paper. We can do simple things. So what we started doing, what we've done for some time at Operative is when we meet government, when we meet others, we often take tenants with us. So rather than me and my team or other senior staff sort of saying, well, this is what our tenants think. Well, look, I'm a member of staff, I've got a view. Well, actually sitting next to me is a tenant. There are easy ways to do these things. But also I think it's really important to have honest conversations. So what we've been doing at Optivo since Grenfell is just asking the question, talking to residents, saying, well, how do you feel safe in your home? If you don't, well, what could we do about that? And just to finish on sort of some quick examples of what we've done. The first is we had a really good fire safety scrutiny project on communications, which won an Inside Housing Award a little while ago. And that was, tenant-led interviews, workshops, door knocking, telephone calls, video calls, a really inclusive range of engagement, just with tenants saying to other tenants, well, how do you feel? Do you feel safe? Do you understand, how to evacuate your block? And those really honest conversations led to some real insights, lots of recommendations, all of which were accepted by the exec team and the board. Really, really valuable work. Second thing we've been doing as part of the MHCLG Fire Safety Group is some more formal research with our tenants, and that's been around evacuation methods. Do you understand the evacuation methods in your block, and how do you feel about them? And that was really interesting because what it showed, which none of us will be surprised by, in the aftermath of Grenfell, lots of residents in blocks that had a stay put policy said, yeah, actually, I do understand the policy. We think you've communicated that pretty well. But we'll evacuate. After Grenfell, we don't trust the advice from the fire brigade around stay put. So there are some really interesting and challenging issues here once you start to talk properly to tenants. And the final thing is we've been working with our Director of Fire Safety on a co-creation project to say, look, there's loads of learning here, but let's work with residents hand in hand as equals to actually design new communications, to design new training for staff on this stuff. So to move away from just consulting residents to actually working side by side as a single team with residents to get this right. So I think they're all the key things I wanted to say, Martin. Really looking forward to questions and discussion.
Thanks very much, Alan, and thanks to all of our panel for some really thought-provoking opening statements. And we've got about 16, 17 minutes to take questions. We've had a huge number coming through, so I'm pretty much going to ignore my questions and move on to the questions that have been coming through to make sure we've got as many as possible that we get a chance to answer. And I'm going to start with one, which and Darren, I'll bring you back in. And I think this is from Jan. Welcome, Jan. And it's we would be very interested in the cross-sector tenant group. Are you able to provide details, please? And I think we've heard about various different groups today, but certainly, obviously, there was a steering group that was looking to set up a national voice for tenants. So it'd be quite interesting to understand why that's kind of struggled to kind of get off the ground, if you like, and where you see that going. And then I think we'll look at some of the regional groups, because we've got a few questions coming in along those lines. And I should say, Jan, you asked a question about HRB engagement strategies. I'm afraid that as soon as I saw that, I thought single regeneration budget, which shows my age. So can you just update on what that's referring to, and I'll ask your question as well. Darren, over to you.
Thank you, Martin. So that group, just to be clear, was not in any way purporting to be a representative group. It was a group of people that, some of which had some involvement in the original National Tenant Voice a decade or so ago, but essentially it was a number of organisations and individuals that had come together to support and really lobby alongside the key questions which were being asked by in the original Green Paper, for additional research to be undertaken to explore what options might be available for a national platform to be established. So it didn't in any way say this is what we believe. What it was saying was there's more work that needs to be done here. It needs to be tenant-led, but it needs to be funded. And I think that kind of really reflects the issues and challenges that these sorts of groups might have, is that if you haven't got either the political support or any funding to sustain it in the long term, it's really difficult for those bodies to be able to maintain themselves. And that's why I think there needs to be something which is kind of supported and funded by the sector in order to be able to move forward. I think there's still very much a need for that research to be undertaken and for those options to be explored. And we're still pushing for that, as I know a number of other organisations are.
And Darren, do you think that will be acceptable to tenants and residents? I mean, you talk about funding from the sector, and I know that's one of the issues that raised its head a number of times during the discussions on that steering group. And I think if there's been any pushback against Together with Tenants, I think it's been the idea that it's kind of controlled, that it is funded and supported by the sector. And if there's been any pushback, it's been with relation to that. So do you think you can have a model that's funded by the sector but actually is also credible in the eye of tenants and residents?
Well, I think ultimately, that's what I want the research to be undertaken to explore, to see whether it is going to be feasible. But in theory, yes. Will that be sufficient? No. It will need action and outcomes and commitment to actually delivery, and as a result of that. But I think it represents a good, decent first stage in order to be able to move things forward, where at the moment there just isn't. I should also point out that where we've said about voices of tenants, I mean, it is nothing will ever achieve something which takes the great sort of heterogeneity of tenant and resident experiences and views. But what it does do is it could add to the diversity of the decision making, which we haven't got at the moment. And that's where more effective decision making could be made at a national level.
Thanks very much, Darren. And I'm going to move to some of the structures that already exist or might exist, and we'll slowly move towards that kind of regional discussion, because there's, like I say, a few questions are relating to that. But I'll come up with a specific question from Jan that I was just talking about, who's updated. Thanks very much, Jan. Do you have, and it's a high-rise building engagement strategy, and could you share the information on the high-rise building engagement group and issues identified to date? That was directed at you, Sasha. So, just wonder whether there are specific groups, perhaps, representative of tenants in high-rises, to what's feeding through from those groups if they do exist. So, Sasha, over to you.
Interesting, really. I think Alan actually covered some of that in terms of the remarks that he was making, because we very much focused post-Grenfell on setting up in our high rise. We've got 4 high rises, tenants and resident engagement. They're actually mainly tenants. And the focus has very much been on effective communication, understanding, as Alan was outlining, evacuation strategies. And in fact, with tenant engagement, we sort of and obviously working with the fire service together with the tenants, we did actually amend the strategies there, and also looked at best ways of communicating, and looking at different risks. And the perspective that we got through listening to tenants was that some of the risks that they were concerned about were things like electrical appliances that customers might have in their homes, and what more could we do to kind of address issues of customers buying cheap electrical goods and things like that. So it was just a very different perspective potentially, by being able to work with those customers. And the important thing is sort of co-creating strategies and focusing on issues that customers deem important. And then through that work, we were able to work with other landlords across Greater Manchester, and to produce some really great videos with customers and with the fire service about the issues that customers generally were concerned about who were living in high rise. So there's been an awful lot of sort of very practical work that has come out of that. And we're continuing to work with those customers in terms of their priorities and what they would like to see happen. And it's also helped with things like we installed sprinklers, for example, and there are always issues about getting 100% access to every property. And I just think having customers on board and sort of co-designing and co-agreeing what you're going to do just helps in terms of sort of being able to make buildings safer, which is the ultimate aim of all of us. I can certainly share more information after the meeting. I don't want to take up too much time.
That would be great, and a really thorough answer. Thanks, Sasha. Tina, I'm going to move to you next. There's a couple of questions coming in, and then I'm going to broaden to that kind of regional focus, which a few people have mentioned in the presentations, and there's certainly a number of questions about. But this is a question about the ease of forming groups now, and this is from Pam. Welcome, Pam. With Zoom and other online formats, don't you think getting a national tenants group representing all areas could now be easily formed? So yeah, basically from what you're seeing emerging, is it now much easier to get a kind of representative and diverse group of people feeding into policy? And if so, do you can it be more grassroots than perhaps it would have been easy to do 5, 6, 7 years ago?
I think it definitely is. I think we're digitally engaging with everyone. It's so much different. I think you can get everyone together from the different nations quite easily, to residents, to people from all different tenure. And there are a few things that there are a few things that do need to be done. Organisations need to come together, the likings of TPAS, Taro, CIH and Inside Housing, National Housing Federation. Organisations of that level need to get together a bit more. And that's easily achievable online now. And then residents can equally talk to one another from Scotland to Wales to England now. So online engagement is so much easier. And also if you can fit that around different tenures and requirements as well. I think there is a need for it. And a platform can quite easily be delivered independently using online format. And then we're looking at doing something similar.
And to what extent is it important? I mean, all the presentations address this, but just interested just to ask that question now for tenants to be in the driving seat as well. I mean, again, we'll come to a question in a minute about regional structures, but saying that effectively the idea is to set something up, but then hand residents the reins in effect. Is that what you're seeing happening as well? Is it, to what extent the best practice you've seen over the last kind of year or so? Are residents actually in control of setting the terms of engagement, if you like, which Alan raised in his presentation?
You're seeing a lot more of it. I think the points that have been raised previously is that when you speak to residents want to have that independent voice, and we're looking at launching, for example, a safety and wellbeing residents forum up in Scotland, totally independently ran. We'll be just providing a platform for conversation. There is appetite for it, I think, and this is where the independence is needed so much. Because when you have organisations running that whole notion of RSLs having a platform for many residents, some people feel included, some people feel excluded. And some of those platforms are very much set up for social housing. But when you start going out and speaking to homeowners, especially around the net zero conversation, the decarbonisation, they want to be engaged, but there is no platform for them. So there is an appetite for a different tenure to be involved now more than ever. And that's what we're seeing, and a drive coming from the residents themselves.
Thanks very much, Tina. And Alan, I'm going to move to you next and pick up on that point you were making about it must be tenant-led. I mean, obviously a number of points, but that one specifically, is that what you're seeing coming through now, or is that still the kind of gap when it comes to what most organisations are doing anyway? And then we'll move on to some questions about the regional structure. I just wonder, to what extent is that really what you're seeing when you're introducing your own structures and you're looking around at what the rest of the sector's doing as well? Is it really tenant-led, or is there still a gap?
Yeah, no, I think there is still a gap, because I think one of the challenges, Martin, in the sector is that you know, different bits of the sector are moving at different speeds. So I think you've got some organisations like Optivo and others where we're trying to experiment, where you're trying to use co-creation. You know, we're trying to, you know, get tenants involved in much more meaningful ways. And then you've got some organisations who are still refusing to sign up to the Together with Tenants Charter, you know, and don't see resident involvement as a big priority. So I think we've got a sort of multi-speed sector going on, which is quite challenging. But I think that's one of the reasons why any sort of new body, I think, would need to be genuinely tenant-led, because I think that's what would make it distinctive. That's what would make it, you know, have some value to add in what, as I mentioned, is quite a sort of busy field.
And in terms of this busy field, because we're talking about, I guess, the gap being this kind of national level engagement, perhaps we're talking about regional structures, and the Northeast the tenant's voice. Jane saying it's in its infancy, but has a great number of customers who want to work together away from their landlords to lobby on important subjects to them. So that's one. But we talked about Together with Tenants, what the Ombudsman's doing. There are all these kind of groups forming. Do you see them in some way coalescing? I mean, is it going to be something that kind of pulls that together in some kind of coherent way? So Alan, to you, and then I'll bring others in.
Well, I think I'm quite relaxed about this, actually. I mean, I think there's a benefit in sort of multiple voices, because, as I think we've all said, you know, the sector's incredibly diverse. You know, when you door knock in blocks, which obviously we all did, you know, before lockdown, you know, every door you knock on, people are totally different. You know, so I think often government has an instinct to pull everything together into one place, but I think, you know, having a national tenant voice and various consultation bodies and various other things going on, you know, I think there's a strength in multiple voices, personally.
Really interesting. And Sasha, I'll move back to you. Oh, sorry, Tina, were you looking to come in there? Sorry.
No, I just want to say I totally agree. I think it is about, I think there's a few questions coming about empowerment and engagement in here. I think residents do need to have that sense of independence and be totally independent to have their voice heard. And I think there is the whole notion of the culture. I think you've got to have a culture within the sector to allow that to happen. But bodies do need to be working more closer together.
Really interesting, and this is this point that Jane's making, and Helen, who also is involved in the Northeast Tenants Voice. So good idea, Helen, saying to involve an organisation like TPAS, and then the residents will take over the reins. Jane talking about the Northeast group being established. Sasha, I mean, you were talking about the Greater Manchester group. Do you see, I mean, is it possible that we're going to create a national tenant voice by default, almost, that you'll have some powerful regional groups emerging, possibly some other powerful voices? That kind of question about whether you think they'll kind of start to come together and create a national voice, perhaps that will not just deal with regional issues, but engage with governments more widely. Is it going to be created by default almost?
I'm not sure, because I do support the idea that there will be diverse voices, and people, and tenants are people are different, people have different views, there's different tenures, and there's also different property types. And I can only speak from my own experience, but for example, where you've got complete customer empowerment, so co-ops and community-led groups, they might have a different view and a different level of engagement to, say, a tenant voice group with it, where a landlord's working with their tenant. And in some cases, as Tina showed in her diagram, it could just be consultation. At the other end, it could be co-creation, which Optivo and ourselves are experimenting with and doing, and others are as well. So it's very difficult to, at this moment in time, to say what the ultimate national platform might be, and that's why I was raising all those questions about it. But that doesn't mean I don't think it's a really important body to have. Particularly, I am concerned about the voice at government level. Who is lobbying government with a tenant voice at the moment? And is that strong enough? And could to me, that's a really powerful outcome, as well as lobbying back to landlords. I think there's a two-way thing that needs to happen here on a national level, and I would like to see the regions powering up to do that as well. Obviously, very big supporter of regionalism, but I do think there's a place for it.
And I'm just going to fire very quickly your own question back at you, just to see where you think it should be. You talk about a voice, a platform, or an organisation. What's your feeling about what's kind of missing?
I think probably
at a national level.
I think Darren's right. If there isn't an organisation with funding from some source, and I'm not sure whether it should be landlords, or another way to fund it, then I think that would be very important and very powerful. So I think we need both, if I'm being honest. But without an organisation, there's a worry that the platform will sort of come and go. But an organisation, I think, perhaps has got more longevity to it.
Thanks, Sasha. And I think, I'd agree with that. And I think, again, brings us back to how we get to that point. And Darren, I'll just finish with you. I know we're slightly over, so I'm just going to hurl a last question at you, if you can answer it very quickly, and then we'll wrap things up. But there's a question from Debbie. For tenants to be truly in the driving seat, do you think the sector needs to change culture, attitude, and work towards eliminating stigma? And maybe all housing associations should begin with having tenants as board members. So should they all have tenant board members? That again, over the last 10 years, that's been a real kind of moving debate, and is tackling stigma an important thing for to move towards some of the goals we've been talking about. And I'm sorry, Darren, I'll give you about a minute and a half to answer those, so as brief as you can, if that's all right.
Okay, Martin, quite a multi-pronged question. I guess on the first point, just to highlight, I think there needs to be, for the longevity, as Sasha was saying, a national platform. There's going to be some research that's released, which we will publish as well on our own website this week, which will highlight one of the key recommendations is the need for a national tenant platform to be established to also counter some of the negative stigma that exists at national policy level making. So I think it's important to highlight that. In terms of the specific question on tenant board members, I think there's been some important movement the other way in terms of strengthening the skills of boards. But I'd come back to my point earlier about decision making. The same applies to governance. Effective decisions come from a greater diversity of inputs through that process, and residents and tenants can help in that diversity. But it is sometimes a double-edged sword. So I think there might be other ways of achieving that as well, because if you're a tenant, it can sometimes be quite a burden. And even if you are a tenant, that doesn't mean that you necessarily reflect the views and experiences of other tenants and residents. So it can positively change the culture of the boardroom, but I don't think it's the only thing. And there's all these other things which we've discussed today, which are important in order to change the overall culture of a landlord.
Thank you very much, Darren, and I'm really sorry because there's more questions we could get into, but hopefully we covered a decent cross section there. And thank you all very much. And I should say that Helen was volunteering to pass on information about the North East Tenants Voice. Helen, I'll drop you a line actually because I'll be quite interested in picking up on that in the pages of Inside Housing. So thanks very much for getting in touch. All that remains for me to do is to bring the event to a close and to thank our fantastic panelists for taking part for some really thought-provoking contributions. Thank you to ACO for the sponsorship and for making today possible. Thank you very much. And thank you, everybody, for tuning in and for your questions and contributing to a really great session. I know a few people have asked about this, so just a reminder that the webinar, including the slides, will be available on our website, Inside Housing's website, from next week. So if you want to go back over the slides, then that's where you can find them. So yeah, thank you all very much. Really enjoyed today's session. Absolutely vital topic, and yeah, see you all soon. Thank you very much.